So they add a ton of power, but they're still in a landing configuration. They've got a lot of flap out. The airplane doesn't really want to accelerate or climb. You're trying to force it to do both at the same time. Hey, welcome back to the channel. It's great to have you here. I do appreciate it. Please like this video. Leave a comment if you find the topic of interest to you. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because the more you grow the channel, the more people see this content and the happier I am. Today, we're going to talk about power on stalls, what used to be known as a departure stall, and we'll use our handy dandy P40 to illustrate how it works. The key to remember is, just like when we talk about power off stalls, the stall doesn't really have much to do with airspeed, although there is a published stall airspeed. But keep in mind, your aircraft can stall at any airspeed in any configuration. It doesn't matter if you're climbing or diving. It doesn't matter if you're upright or inverted. The aircraft can stall if we do one thing: exceed the critical angle of attack. And that's really all there is to it. But with the departure stall, the power on stall, this is often misunderstood by people because they think it happens on climb out and it won't happen anywhere else. It just means you've got a relatively high power setting. It doesn't even have to be a full power setting. If we exceed that critical angle of attack, if we pitch up faster than the relative wind can adjust to us and the wing exceeds that critical angle of attack, we stall. Let's talk about a couple of situations where that might happen that you want to know about before you get into those situations. Typically, the way we'll demonstrate a power on stall is we'll be in cruise flight. We'll do clearing turns, 2 90-degree turns, or we'll do a 180-degree turn. We'll make sure the area is clear. Then we'll slow the aircraft down to rotation speed. And at rotation speed, we'll add power in a takeoff configuration and pitch up for a little less than what we would normally have in a normal climb situation. So less than VX, so we can force the airplane to stall. It actually takes a fair amount of work on most training airplanes. They're designed to be fairly benign, but that's not true of all planes, and that's why it's important we understand the power on stall, because when you go from that benign trainer to maybe a sporty, faster aircraft, higher wing loading, higher horsepower, that can be a pretty exciting power on stall, not the little bloop that you experienced in your flight training. We pitch up, and by the way, if you look at the ACS, the Airman Certification Standard, it doesn't say you have to be at full power. As a matter of fact, there are aircraft where at full power, it's really going to be problematic to do a power on stall. You've got to be at least 65% power. So we slow ourselves down to rotation speed, we add power, we pitch up somewhat aggressively, the aircraft stalls. Just like the power off stall, the nose will drop, reducing the angle of attack. Now the aircraft is flying again. We can clean up the configuration if necessary, and we gradually get our altitude back. We don't have to do anything quickly, provided we're coordinated. The rudder and the ailerons are all together. If you're uncoordinated when you stall, that gives a yawing motion, and that begins a spin, because a spin is just a stall with a yawing component. If you're uncoordinated, you have a yawing component. Now let's talk about two very real circumstances where you could find yourself getting into a power on stall unintentionally in the worst possible place, close to the ground. One of them is you're coming into land, and as you get down low, you realize there's an obstruction on the runway. Maybe it's another aircraft. Maybe it's a bunch of deer. Maybe the kid with the fuel truck drove out on the runway and you realize, I have to go around. This is an easy thing, and it's not really an emergency maneuver. We level off to maintain altitude, add power, clean up the aircraft, and climb away as normal. What people will tend to do, especially people who haven't practiced a go-around in a long time, and be honest, you probably haven't, because most people don't. What they'll do is they're coming in and they see that obstruction, they immediately yank the nose high, which causes a lot of drag at a low power setting. Because we now have a low power setting and a high pitch attitude, we start slowing down pretty rapidly, which tends to make us start to sink, which tends to make the pilot a little nervous. So they add a ton of power, but they're still in a landing configuration. They've got a lot of flap out. The airplane doesn't really want to accelerate or climb. You're trying to force it to do both at the same time. What can happen there is we come in for that landing, we jump aggressively into that go around, and all of a sudden we find ourselves at a high pitch attitude, the airspeed bleeding off, suddenly pump in a whole bunch of power and it stalls. Unfortunately, we're not at 3,000 feet where that's a simple recovery. Maybe we're only at 100 feet. This is going to get really exciting. So it's important that you understand how to do a go around in a very methodical manner, where the point is not to go directly from descent for landing to climbing to get out of there. Have an intermediate step of just leveling off, cleaning up the aircraft, and building speed. Then you can climb away. The other place you'll see somebody inadvertently stall, hopefully not you, because this one's pretty bad. Let's face it, we're cool. We want to enjoy the exhilaration of flight. So we get out there at the hold short line, we make our radio call, we get out on the runway, and we start running down, we get ourselves into ground effect, and instead of climbing away at VX or VY as we normally would, we hold that airplane down in ground effect, maybe 10 feet off the deck. We accelerate dramatically because in ground effect, we don't have nearly as much drag as we would higher up. So the aircraft is accelerating really well. We might even get up very near cruise speed by the time we run out of runway. Then we get down and we just yank the nose up so we can climb like crazy, impress our friends, and really feel that exhilaration of flight. The problem with that is, as we yank it up like that, we could easily exceed the critical angle of attack and cause that stall at maybe 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, a low altitude where we're at a high power setting. Maybe we've gotten that right rudder in, and maybe we haven't. But now we're at a very low altitude, at a very high pitch attitude. It's going to stall, and if we don't react to that right now, that becomes a real problem. So when we talk about the power on stall, don't just think of it as something you've got to get through with your CFI so that you can get past your DPE and you hope you just do one and move on. Really try and understand what causes that stall to happen. And it is largely when we have a major pitch change. Can have to do with turbulence as well. If we've got turbulent air where a pitch up combined with some turbulent air could lead to that stall. So we want to be very aware of VA, our maneuvering speed, because if we're above that and we stall the aircraft, we could damage it on the way to that stall. It might actually deform before we get to the stall. There's all kinds of things to think about, but the basics are, don't be excessively aggressive. For goodness sakes, don't show off. You're a pilot. You're already cool. Nobody's going to be any more impressed by some big pull-up. And really understand that the airplane will stall when you exceed the critical angle of attack. It has very little to do with airspeed. I know there's a published airspeed. It's in your POH. It's in your aircraft flight manual. Your CFI talks to you about it. There's quiz questions on it. It's okay. I understand. It's even marked on the airspeed indicator at the bottom of the wide arc. It's okay. I get that. But you can stall at any airspeed in any attitude. And if you realize I can be inverted in a dive and still stall the airplane if I aggressively maneuver it beyond what it can handle. Doesn't matter. Any airspeed, any attitude, if we exceed that critical angle of attack, that's going to get us into a power on stall. So work on it with your CFI, work on it during your flight review, be good at the power on stall, and all of a sudden everything else gets easier. Thanks so much for being with us this week. I hope you learned something out of this, and I hope I see you out there on the ramp someplace. Until then, see you next time.